I married at 16 to a black man with a massive dick. Well, with a presence that changed everything about who I thought I was, and my life was never the same. Not in the way folks might think when they hear those words. Not in the simple way. Lord knows, nothing about what happened to me was simple. My name is Ilara, though most folks around Stowe just call me Mrs. Donovan now, and they know me as the quiet widow who tends her garden and bakes pies for the church social. They see this old woman, in her worn cardigan, moving slow through the grocery aisles, and they think they know my story. They think I've lived a life as predictable as the Vermont seasons, as gentle as the morning mist that rolls down from our mountains. But they don't know about the girl I was at 16. They don't know about Cadan Blackwood and the way he could fill a room just by walking into it. They don't know about the years that followed, the ones that taught me that love and terror can wear the same face, that salvation can come in the quietest voice, and that sometimes you have to lose yourself completely before you can find who you're meant to be. I'm fixing to tell you that story now, the whole truth of it, because I've carried it alone for too long. Every scar, every moment of shame, every small victory I carved out with my own bleeding hands. I'm going to tell you how a 16-year-old girl from a good family became something she never planned to be, and how that same girl found her way back to the light, even when it seemed impossible. So settle in with me here, if you will. Let me share this burden I've been carrying, because maybe in the telling, both of us might find something we didn't know we were looking for. Maybe you'll see that no matter how dark the road gets, there's always a chance for morning to come again. I suppose I should start by telling you about Stowe, Vermont, the way it was back in 1960. Picture this little town nestled between mountains that turned every shade of fire come October, where the church bells still rang at 6 in the morning and everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. The kind of place where your reputation was everything, and a young girl's virtue was watched over like a prized heifer at the county fair. My daddy ran the hardware store on Main Street, and my mama, well, she was what you'd call a pillar of the community. Every Sunday morning you'd find her in the front pew of First Baptist, hat pinned just so, back straight as a board, making sure the whole congregation could see that the Hayes family was right with the Lord. We lived in a white house with blue shutters, had a vegetable garden that was Mama's pride, and everything was exactly as it should be for a respectable family in a respectable town. I was their only child, born late in their lives when Mama was already past 40 and had given up hope of babies. They doted on me something fierce, but in that careful way that folks do when they're scared of breaking something precious. I had piano lessons and Sunday school, proper dresses that covered my knees, and a future all mapped out that involved marrying the banker's son and having grandbabies for Mama to spoil. But Lord, forgive me, I was 16 and restless as a caged bird. All those proper plans felt like a dress 2 sizes too small, pinching and binding until I could hardly breathe. I wanted something more than the safe little life they'd planned for me, though I couldn't have told you what that something was if you'd asked. That's when Cadan Blackwood came to town. He wasn't the first black man we'd seen in Stowe, mind you, but he was the first one who stayed longer than it took to pass through on his way to somewhere else. He'd come up from the south, said he had business with the lumber mill, and he took a room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house on Elm Street. The talk started the minute he stepped off that Greyhound bus. A tall, broad-shouldered man with skin dark as coffee beans and a smile that could charm honey from a bee. Mama told me to stay away from that kind of trouble, and Daddy made it clear that no daughter of his would be caught speaking to one of them. But you know how it is when you're 16 and everyone's telling you not to look at something, it's all you can think about. I first saw him at Murphy's 5 and Dime, buying a pack of cigarettes and a Coca-Cola. He was wearing a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and when he smiled at old Mr. Murphy, I swear the whole store seemed to brighten. He had this way about him, this confidence that made every other man in town look small and scared by comparison. "Afternoon, miss," he said to me as I stood there gulping like a fish out of water. His voice was deep and smooth as molasses, with just a hint of the South still clinging to the edges. I felt my face go red as a beet, mumbled something that might have been hello, and practically ran out of that store. But I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he'd looked at me. Not like I was a child to be protected or a prize to be won, but like I was a woman worth noticing. For 2 weeks, I found excuses to walk past Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, hoping to catch another glimpse of him. And then one evening, as I was coming home from choir practice, there he was, sitting on the front steps of the boarding house, playing a guitar and humming something low and sweet that seemed to make the very air shimmer around him. "Good evening, Miss Hayes," he said, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. He knew my name. Lovely night for music, don't you think? I should have kept walking. Should have remembered Mama's warnings and Daddy's stern looks. Should have thought about what people would say if they saw me talking to him. Instead, I stopped. I stood there on that sidewalk with the fireflies dancing around us and the smell of honeysuckle thick in the air, and I said, "It surely is." That was the beginning. That was the moment when my safe little world started to crack wide open. Though I was too young and too foolish to understand what I was inviting into my life, because what I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn until it was far too late, was that Cadan Blackwood hadn't come to Stowe by accident. He'd been watching me, studying me, learning everything about the naive little white girl with the sheltered life and the rebellious heart. And I was about to discover that some kinds of attention come with a price you don't know you're paying until the bill comes due. Those next few weeks felt like living in a dream that I knew I'd have to wake up from, but Lord help me, I didn't want to. Every evening after supper, I'd find some excuse to walk past Mrs. Henderson's place, needed to return a book to the library, had to check on Mrs. Albright's sick cat, anything that would take me down Elm Street right around the time Cadan would be sitting on those front steps with his guitar. He never pushed, never made me feel foolish for lingering, just smiled that easy smile of his and asked about my day, my dreams, my thoughts on everything from the weather to the books I was reading. Nobody had ever talked to me like that before, like what I had to say actually mattered, like I was more than just Pastor Hayes' well-behaved daughter. "You've got a mind, Miss Ilara," he told me one evening as we sat on opposite ends of those boarding house steps, careful to keep a respectable distance between us. Most folks around here seem to have forgotten that young ladies are capable of thinking. The way he said my name, drawing it out like he was savoring each syllable, made something flutter in my chest that I'd never felt before. His voice had this quality to it, deep and warm like bourbon, though I wouldn't know that comparison for a few more years yet. He told me stories about the places he'd been: New Orleans with its jazz music floating through the French Quarter like perfume, Chicago where the buildings stretched so high they seemed to scrape the belly of heaven itself. He painted pictures with his words of a world beyond the mountains that hemmed us in, a world where a girl could be anything she wanted to be, not just what her family and her town expected. "You ever think about leaving this place, Miss Ilara?" he asked me one night when the crickets were singing their evening song and the porch light cast everything in a golden glow. "Ever wonder what's waiting for you out there in the big wide world?" Truth was, I'd never let myself think too hard about it before. Leaving Stowe seemed as impossible as growing wings and flying over Mount Mansfield. But when Cadan talked about it, his dark eyes gleaming with possibility, it didn't seem impossible at all. It seemed like the most natural thing in the world. That's when he started bringing me little gifts. Nothing fancy or expensive that would raise questions: a wildflower he'd picked on his walk, a smooth river stone that caught the light just right, a piece of sheet music he'd copied out by hand for a song he thought I'd like. Each gift came with a story, and each story made me hunger for more. The evening he brought me that book of poetry, Langston Hughes, though I'd never heard the name before, was the night everything changed between us. We'd been talking for near on a month by then, and I was already half in love with him, though I didn't have words for what I was feeling. "This here's a man who understands what it means to dream," Cadan said, pressing the slim volume into my hands. Our fingers touched for just a moment, but it was like lightning had passed between us. "Read The Dreamkeeper, Miss Ilara. I think you'll understand why I wanted to share it with you." I read that poem when I got home, hiding under my covers with a flashlight like I was looking at something forbidden. "Bring me all of your dreams, you dreamers. Bring me all your heart melodies, that I may wrap them in a blue cloud cloth away from the too rough fingers of the world." Lord, those words seemed to reach right inside my chest and squeeze my heart. The next evening, I found him waiting for me with something like sadness in his eyes. "My business here is about finished," he said, and I felt the bottom drop out of my world. "I'll be moving on soon, heading west to Oregon, where I've got work waiting." I must have gone pale as milk, because he reached out and touched my hand the first time he'd ever done such a thing, and his skin was warm and rough from work. Nothing like the soft hands of the boys I'd known all my life. "Unless," he said, and his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper, "unless I had a reason to stay, or a reason to take someone with me." That's when he told me he loved me. Not the puppy love that the local boys offered up like candy at a church social, but something deeper and more serious. He said he'd been watching me, waiting to see if I was as special as he'd hoped, and that I'd exceeded every expectation he'd had. I know it's not conventional, he said, still holding my hand in his larger one. I know your folks won't approve, and this town surely won't understand, but I'm a good man, Miss Alara, with good prospects and a heart that's been waiting for someone exactly like you. I was 16 and head over heels, and when he kissed me that night, soft and gentle, like I was made of spun glass, I thought I'd found my destiny. The taste of peppermint and tobacco on his lips, the way he smelled like sandalwood and something indefinably masculine, the feel of his hands framing my face like I was precious beyond measure. What I didn't know, what he was careful not to let me see, was the calculating look that flickered behind his eyes when he thought I wasn't watching. I didn't know that everything he'd told me about himself was as carefully crafted as those stories he spun about distant cities. I didn't know that the poetry and the gifts and the gentle courtship were all part of a plan that had been in motion since the day he first stepped off that bus. Most of all, I didn't know that I wasn't the first young girl whose heart he'd captured with sweet words and sweeter promises. But I was about to learn that some men are expert fishermen, and they know exactly what bait to use to catch the fish they're after. The night I found out I was carrying Caden's baby was the night I stopped being a child forever. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at my reflection in Mama's old hand mirror, looking for some sign that everything had changed. But I looked exactly the same green eyes, same freckles across my nose, same brown hair that never would hold a curl, no matter how many pin curls Mama set. It had been 6 weeks since that first kiss, 6 weeks of stolen moments and whispered promises. We'd been meeting in secret at the old Miller barn, on the outskirts of town, a place where the hay still smelled sweet from summer and the late afternoon light filtered through the cracks in golden streams. That's where it happened, where I gave myself to him completely, body and soul, believing with every fiber of my being that we were going to be married just as soon as he could make proper arrangements. Don't you worry about a thing, my sweet girl. He'd whispered against my hair that day, holding me close as I cried from the pain and the overwhelming rush of feelings I didn't understand. This just makes us more bound together, makes what we have more real. But when I told him about the baby, standing in that same barn with my hands shaking and my voice barely above a whisper, something shifted in his eyes. It was subtle, so quick I almost missed it, but for just a moment I saw something cold and calculating where there had always been warmth before. Well now, he said, setting down the apple he'd been eating and looking at me with what I thought was concern. That does complicate things, doesn't it? Complicate things. Those words echoed in my head for days afterward. Not how wonderful or we'll figure this out together. Just ... complicate things. That's when the real Kadan started to show himself, piece by careful piece. He was still charming, still spoke those beautiful words that made my heart flutter. But there was a new edge to him, a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. He started talking about how we needed to be married quickly, quietly, before anyone found out about my condition. Your folks won't understand at first, he said, taking my hands in his but somehow making the gesture feel less like comfort and more like possession. But once we're legally wed, once the baby comes, they'll see that this was meant to be, that we were meant to be. I wanted to believe him. Lord, how I wanted to believe him. But something deep in my belly, something beyond the baby growing there, was starting to twist with a fear I couldn't name. The changes in him became more obvious as the days passed. He'd always been confident, but now there was an arrogance that made me uncomfortable. He started making decisions for both of us without asking what I thought. Where we'd go for our honeymoon, how we'd tell my parents, even what I should wear to our small ceremony. Trust me, sweetheart, became his favorite phrase whenever I questioned anything. I know how these things work. I know what's best for us. But it was the night I overheard him talking to someone outside Mrs. Henderson's boarding house that everything started to unravel in my mind. I'd come to see him, to talk about my growing worries about how we'd tell my parents, when I heard his voice carrying through the open window of his room. Yeah, I got her right where I want her, he was saying to someone, I couldn't see who. Sweet little thing, naive as they come. Her daddy owns half the businesses on Main Street. Did you know that? This is going to work out better than I planned. I stood there in the shadows of the elm trees, my hand pressed to my mouth to keep from making a sound, as he continued talking about me like I was a prize he'd won at a carnival game. He mentioned the baby, but not with the tenderness he'd shown me, talked about it like it was just another piece of his plan falling into place. That's when I realized I didn't really know anything about Kadan Blackwood at all. I didn't know where he'd really come from, what his real business in Stowe had been, or even if Kadan was his real name. All those stories he'd told me, all those dreams he'd painted, how much of it had been real, and how much had been carefully crafted lies designed to catch a foolish girl with stars in her eyes. I crept home that night feeling like my whole world had tilted sideways. Everything I thought I knew about love, about myself, about my future, suddenly seemed as fragile as soap bubbles floating on the wind. I was 16, pregnant, and terrified, and the man I'd given everything to was becoming a stranger before my eyes. But the worst part, the thing that kept me awake staring at the ceiling until dawn, was the growing certainty that I was trapped. My parents would be devastated when they found out about the baby. The town would turn its back on our family. And Caden. Cadden held all the cards now, didn't he? I was beginning to understand that some prisons don't have bars. They have wedding rings, and sweet promises, and the weight of a community's expectations pressing down on you until you can't breathe. The question that haunted me as I lay there in the darkness was whether I was strong enough to find a way out, or if I was already too far gone to save myself from the life that was closing around me like quicksand. What I didn't know yet was that the trap had been even more carefully set than I'd imagined, and that my nightmare was only just beginning. The wedding happened on a gray October morning when the leaves were falling like tears and the air had that bite to it that warns of winter coming. We stood in front of Justice of the Peace Morrison in his cramped little office above the barber shop, with only Mrs. Henderson and her boarder Mr. Jameson as witnesses. I wore my mama's best dress, the blue one with the pearl buttons that she'd been saving for special occasions, though she didn't know I'd borrowed it. My parents still didn't know about the baby, still didn't even know about Kadan. We'd agreed to tell them after the ceremony, when it would be too late for them to interfere. At least, that's what Kadan had convinced me was best. Looking back now, I can see how he'd isolated me from everyone who might have helped me think clearly. But at the time I was so scared and confused that his certainty felt like the only solid thing in my world. I remember standing there repeating those vows, my voice barely above a whisper, while Caden's rang out strong and confident. When Justice Morrison pronounced us man and wife, Kadan kissed me with a possessiveness that should have warned me about what was coming, but I was too numbed to pay attention to the signals my body was trying to send. The walk to my parents' house felt like walking to my own execution. Kadan held my arm firmly, steering me forward whenever I hesitated, whispering reassurances that sounded more like commands. When we reached the front porch with its familiar white railings and Mama's flower boxes, I wanted nothing more than to turn and run. But there was nowhere to run to anymore. The moment I told them, the moment I saw Daddy's face go white as fresh snow and Mama's hand fly to her throat like she couldn't breathe, I knew that the girl I'd been was gone forever. The disappointment in their eyes cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever felt. Mama started crying, not the delicate tears of a church lady, but deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere way down in her soul. Daddy didn't say a word for the longest time, just stood there looking at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into his house. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him. He asked if this was what I really wanted, if I understood what I was throwing away. I wanted to tell him no, wanted to confess my doubts and fears, wanted to fall into his arms and beg him to make everything go back to the way it was. But Caden's hand was on my shoulder, and when I looked up at him, I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold, a warning, clear as day. So I said yes. I said I loved Caden and wanted to be his wife, and I watched something die in my parents' faces as the words left my mouth. The months that followed were like living in a house of mirrors where nothing was quite what it seemed. Kadan found us a small apartment above Murphy's Five and Dime, and suddenly I was playing house with a man I was beginning to realize I didn't know at all. He was charming when he wanted to be, bringing me flowers and telling me how beautiful I looked even as my body changed and swelled with the baby growing inside me. But there were other times when his mask slipped and I caught glimpses of the man underneath. Times when he'd come home smelling of whiskey and other women's perfume. When he'd look at me with something like disgust, like I was a burden he hadn't quite figured out how to shed. The worst part was how he'd made me dependent on him for everything. I couldn't go anywhere without his permission, couldn't spend a dime without his approval. He'd convinced me that my parents had disowned me, that the town was talking about me behind my back, that he was the only person in the world who truly cared about me. And maybe the most shameful part of all was that sometimes, in the dark of night when he'd reach for me with hands that were no longer gentle, I'd remember why I'd fallen for him in the first place. The physical connection between us was unlike anything I'd ever imagined, powerful and consuming in a way that scared me even as it thrilled me. He knew exactly how to touch me to make me forget my fears, how to make my body betray my mind's growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake. When little Orion was born on a snowy February morning, I thought maybe things would change, thought maybe becoming a father would bring out the good man I'd convinced myself was still buried somewhere inside Kadan. And for a while, it seemed like it might work. He was tender with the baby, proud of his son, and for a few precious weeks it felt like we might actually become the family I'd dreamed of. But that illusion shattered the night I found the letters. I was looking for something in his coat pocket, just some loose change to buy milk for the baby, when my fingers closed around a bundle of envelopes tied with string. The return addresses were from different cities, different women's names written in different handwriting. Love letters, all of them, written to the same charming, mysterious man who'd swept into their lives with promises and poetry. I sat on our kitchen floor with those letters spread around me, like evidence of a crime, reading story after story that sounded heartbreakingly familiar. Young women, most of them barely out of their teens, all of them describing the same romantic courtship, the same gentle seduction, the same sudden marriage that had seemed like destiny at the time. Some of the letters were recent, very recent. That's when I understood that I wasn't Caden's first victim, and I wouldn't be his last. I was just another stop on a journey that had been planned long before he ever set foot in Stowe. Another young woman whose trust and love and family money could be harvested and consumed before he moved on to the next town, the next mark. But I also realized something else that night, something that gave me the first spark of hope I'd felt in months. I wasn't completely alone. Somewhere out there were other women who'd survived Kadan Blackwood, other mothers raising his children, other souls who'd learned the hard way that some men are wolves dressed in sheep's clothing, and if they could survive it, maybe I could too. What I didn't know yet was that my education in survival was just beginning, and that the man I'd married was about to show me depths of cruelty I'd never imagined possible. The first time Kadan hit me, I was so shocked I couldn't even cry. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and little Orion was fussing something fierce with his teething. I'd been up all night walking the floor with him, trying to keep him quiet so Kadan could sleep, but nothing seemed to soothe the poor baby. When Kadan stumbled out of the bedroom with his hair all messed up and that look in his eyes that I was learning to fear, I tried to apologize, tried to explain that I'd done everything I could think of, but he wasn't listening, just grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me like a rag doll, telling me I was useless, that I couldn't even handle one crying baby. Then his hand connected with my cheek, and the sound echoed through our little apartment like a gunshot. I stood there holding Orion, my face burning and my ears ringing, while Kadan looked almost as surprised as I felt. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, he was all apologies and explanations, telling me how sorry he was, how tired he'd been, how it would never happen again. But it did happen again, and again, until the bruises became as much a part of my daily routine as feeding the baby or washing the dishes. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though that was bad enough. It was the way he'd convinced me it was my fault. I wasn't keeping house properly. I wasn't taking good enough care of Orion. I wasn't being the kind of wife he deserved after everything he'd done for me. He'd isolated me so completely that I had nowhere to turn. When I'd see Mama at the grocery store, she'd look right through me like I was a ghost. The other women in town would cross the street when they saw me coming, their faces tight with disapproval. Kadan had made sure everyone knew that I was damaged goods, a fallen woman who'd gotten what she deserved. The isolation was suffocating, but what terrified me more was watching how Orion would flinch when his father raised his voice. My baby boy, not even 6 months old, was already learning to fear the sound of angry footsteps and slamming doors. That's when I started planning. Not planning to leave, that still seemed impossible with no money and nowhere to go, but planning to survive. I began hiding small amounts of change whenever I could, tucking them away in an old coffee tin behind the loose board in our bedroom closet. I memorized the bus schedules and the addresses of women's shelters in Burlington, even though I told myself I'd never be brave enough to use them. Most importantly, I started watching Kadan more carefully, learning to read the signs that meant danger was coming. The way his jaw would tighten when he'd had too much to drink, the particular tone his voice took when he was working himself up to violence. The look in his eyes that meant I needed to get Orion and myself out of his way. But what I discovered during those careful observations would change everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married. And it would finally give me the weapon I needed to fight back. The night I followed Kadan to the old railroad depot changed everything I thought I understood about my husband's business. He'd been making these mysterious trips every few weeks since Orion was born, telling me he had to check on some investment opportunities in the next town over. Always left after dark, always came back before dawn with more money than a man doing honest work should have. I'd gotten suspicious when I found those fancy clothes hidden in the back of our closet suits that cost more than we spent on groceries in 3 months. Shoes made of leather so fine it felt like silk under my fingers. When I asked him about them, he got that dangerous look in his eyes and told me to mind my own business. But a woman living in fear learns to pay attention to details that might save her life, and I'd noticed things. The way certain men in town would nod to him with a respect that seemed laced with fear. How conversations would stop when he walked into Murphy's store. The thick envelopes that would appear on our kitchen table after his nighttime trips, envelopes he'd count and recount before hiding them away. So that Tuesday night when he thought I was asleep, I wrapped little Orion in his blanket and followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows between the streetlights. My heart was hammering so hard I was afraid he'd hear it. But I had to know what was drawing my husband out into the darkness. The old depot had been abandoned for years, but there were lights flickering in the windows and the sound of men's voices carrying on the night air. I crept close enough to peer through a broken window, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice water. There was Kadan, but not the Kadan I knew. This man stood straighter, spoke with authority, commanded the attention of a dozen rough-looking men who hung on his every word. They were passing around bottles of what looked like moonshine, counting stacks of money, and talking in low voices about routes and deliveries and keeping the law enforcement in neighboring counties properly motivated to look the other way. My husband wasn't just running some small-time scheme. He was running a bootlegging operation that stretched across half of Vermont. And from what I could piece together from their conversation, he'd been doing it for years, long before he ever came to Stowe. Long before he'd set his sights on the naive banker's daughter who could provide him with the perfect cover of respectability. I'd married a criminal. Not just a man who'd lied about loving me, but someone who'd built his whole life on deception and illegal dealings. Someone who'd chosen me specifically because I was young and trusting, and came from a family that no one would suspect of harboring a bootlegger. But as I stood there in the cold darkness, holding my sleeping baby, and watching my husband orchestrate his criminal enterprise, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't just scared anymore, I was angry, furious, actually, at how completely I'd been used. And anger, I was discovering, could be a powerful thing when you'd been powerless for so long. The morning I found Caden's real name written in that old leather journal was the morning I finally understood just how deep the deception went. I'd been cleaning out the closet, trying to organize our cramped apartment while Orion napped, when my fingers found the notebook wedged behind a loose floorboard. Charles Beaumont. That's what it said on the inside cover, written in Caden's distinctive handwriting. Charles Beaumont, along with a list of towns and dates that went back nearly 10 years. Each entry told the same story with heartbreaking precision. Small towns, young women's names, churches where he'd supposedly found religion, businesses where he'd claimed to have prospects, amounts of money stolen, cons successfully completed, narrow escapes from angry fathers and suspicious law enforcement. My own name was there near the bottom of the list, along with a notation that made my stomach turn. E. Hayes, Stowe, VT. Father owns hardware store. Mother from old money family. Pregnant after 6 weeks, married after 8. Estimated take, $3,000 minimum. I was just another entry in a criminal's notebook, a mark that had paid off exactly as planned. But what terrified me more than discovering my husband's true identity was what came next in those pages. Plans for his next move, detailed notes about a young woman named Margaret who lived in a town called Middlebury, about 40 miles south of us. He'd already been corresponding with her, laying the groundwork for his next romantic conquest while still married to me. And there were other things, darker things. Notes about debts owed to dangerous men in Chicago, about a gambling problem that had gotten out of hand, about pressure from people who didn't take kindly to being cheated. Charles Beaumont wasn't just a small-time con artist anymore. He was in deep with people who solved their problems with violence, and he was using the money from his various schemes to stay one step ahead of them. That's when I realized I wasn't the only one in danger. If these Chicago men caught up with him, if his carefully constructed house of cards came tumbling down, little Orion and I would be collateral damage. We weren't his family to Charles Beaumont. We were just props in his latest performance, and when the curtain came down, he wouldn't hesitate to abandon us to whatever fate awaited. I spent that whole day walking around in a daze, the journal hidden under my mattress like evidence of a crime. Every time I looked at Orion playing with his wooden blocks, every time I caught sight of myself in the mirror with that bruise on my jaw that makeup couldn't quite cover, I felt the walls of my prison closing in tighter. But something else was happening too, something I didn't expect. For the first time since I'd married him, I wasn't just afraid of Charles, I was seeing him clearly, without the romantic fog that had blinded me for so long. He wasn't some mysterious, powerful man who'd chosen me for love. He was a coward and a criminal who preyed on young women because they were easier targets than grown men who might fight back. That night, when he came home reeking of whiskey and another woman's perfume, I watched him differently, studied the way he moved, the tells that gave away his moods, the patterns of his cruelty. I was learning to think like a hunter instead of prey, and the change felt dangerous and exhilarating all at once. What I didn't know was that someone else had been watching too, someone who'd seen through Charles Beaumont's facade from the very beginning and had been waiting for the right moment to act. And that moment was coming sooner than any of us expected. The man who knocked on our door that cold April morning looked like trouble even before he opened his mouth. Tall and thin as a rail, with eyes like chips of ice and a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He asked for Charles Beaumont in a voice that sounded like gravel, and when I told him nobody by that name lived here, he just smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. After he left, Charles was different. Jumpy and mean in a way that was worse than usual. He started drinking earlier in the day, checking the locks on our door multiple times, and peering through the curtains like he expected to see someone watching our apartment. When I asked him what was wrong, he backhanded me so hard I saw stars and told me to keep my mouth shut about things that didn't concern me. But it did concern me, didn't it? Because whatever trouble Charles had brought to our door was going to fall on little Orion and me too. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to take that journal to Sheriff Morrison and tell him everything I'd discovered about my husband's real identity and criminal activities. I was going to turn in the man I'd married, even knowing it would mean scandal and shame for me and my baby. Even knowing the whole town would know what a fool I'd been. It took me 3 days to work up the courage. 3 days of watching Charles pace our small apartment like a caged animal, of jumping every time someone walked past our building, of seeing the fear in his eyes that he thought he was hiding so well. 3 days of holding Orion and wondering if I was brave enough to do what needed to be done. On Thursday morning, while Charles was out making his mysterious rounds, I bundled up the baby and walked to the sheriff's office with that leather journal tucked inside my coat. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the doorknob, but I was going to do it. I was going to end this nightmare once and for all. But when I got there, Sheriff Morrison wasn't alone. He was talking to that same thin man who'd come to our door, and they were bent over a stack of photographs spread across the desk. Photographs of Charles, of our apartment building, of me carrying Orion to the grocery store. I backed away before they could see me, my heart hammering in my chest. These men weren't just looking for Charles Beaumont. They'd been watching all of us, learning our routines, planning something that I didn't want to think about too hard. Walking home with the journal still hidden in my coat, I realized that going to the law wasn't going to save me. Whatever was coming for Charles was bigger than small-town justice could handle, and I needed to find another way out before it was too late. But I was running out of time, and I was running out of options, and I had no idea that salvation was about to arrive from the most unexpected source. The morning they came for Charles, I was hanging laundry on the line behind our building when I heard the gunshots, 3 sharp cracks that echoed off the mountains and sent every bird in town flying toward the sky. I dropped the wet sheet I'd been holding and ran toward the sound, my heart already knowing what my mind didn't want to accept. Our apartment door was hanging off its hinges, and there was blood on the stairs, so much blood that it looked like someone had spilled a bucket of red paint. I could hear Orion crying from inside, that scared, desperate wail that babies make when something terrible has happened nearby. Charles was on the kitchen floor, his white shirt soaked crimson, his eyes staring at nothing. The thin man from before was standing over him, along with two others I'd never seen, all of them calm as Sunday morning despite what they'd just done. One of them was going through Charles's pockets, pulling out money and papers with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. When they saw me in the doorway with my mouth hanging open, the thin man just nodded like we were passing acquaintances on the street. He told me that Charles Beaumont had stolen from the wrong people, that debts had to be paid one way or another, and that I should consider myself lucky they weren't interested in collecting from his widow. Then they walked out of my apartment like nothing had happened, leaving me standing there with my husband's blood seeping into the floorboards and my baby screaming in the next room. I don't remember much about the hours that followed. I remember Sheriff Morrison arriving, but not being surprised to see him. I remember the questions he asked, but not the answers I gave. I remember the neighbors gathering in the hallway, whispering among themselves about how they'd always known that black men would bring trouble to their town. What I remember most clearly was the moment I realized I was free. It sounds terrible to say it, but standing there looking at Charles's body, all I could think was that the nightmare was finally over. No more walking on eggshells, no more bruises to hide, no more wondering when he'd decide that Orion and I had outlived our usefulness. The man who'd destroyed my innocence and stolen my youth was gone, and I didn't have to pretend to grieve for him. But freedom, I was learning, could be just as terrifying as captivity. Because now I was a 19-year-old widow with a baby and no money, living in a town that had never fully accepted me and certainly wouldn't help me now. My parents had made it clear that I'd chosen my path when I married Charles, and they weren't interested in welcoming their prodigal daughter home. The life insurance money helped, though I never asked too many questions about where Charles had gotten a policy or whether the name on it was even real. It was enough to bury him properly and keep Orion and me fed for a few months while I figured out what came next. What came next was the hardest decision I'd ever made. I was going to leave Stowe, start over somewhere nobody knew about Charles Beaumont, or the foolish girl who'd fallen for his lies. I was going to raise my son away from the whispers and the judgment, in a place where we could both have a chance at a real life, but I was also going to carry the truth with me forever, that sometimes the only way out of hell is through it, and that surviving doesn't always look the way you think it will. The biggest shock of my life came 3 months after Charles's funeral. When I was packing up our apartment to leave Stowe for good, I'd sold what little we owned and bought bus tickets to Burlington, where I'd heard there was work in the textile mills for women who weren't afraid of long hours and hard labor. I was ready to disappear, to become someone new who'd never been foolish enough to fall for a con man's pretty words. That's when I found the letter. It was tucked inside the pages of my old Bible, the one Mama had given me for my confirmation. Written in a woman's careful handwriting, it was addressed to me but had never been opened. The postmark showed it had arrived just days before Charles died, but somehow I'd never seen it. The letter was from a woman named Ruth Patterson in Chicago, and what she told me changed everything I thought I knew about my husband's death. She'd been married to Charles Beaumont for 3 years, before he abandoned her and their twin daughters to come north and find his next mark. But Ruth wasn't just another victim. She'd spent 2 years tracking him down, learning about his criminal activities, building a case against him that would have put him in prison for the rest of his life. More than that, she'd been in contact with 4 other women Charles had married and abandoned. Together, they'd hired a private investigator to find him, and they'd been the ones who'd tipped off his Chicago creditors about where he was hiding. They'd orchestrated his downfall as carefully as he'd orchestrated their seductions. Ruth wrote that she was sorry for any pain his death had caused me, but that they'd all agreed it was better for him to face his criminal associates than to continue destroying innocent lives. She also wrote that they'd been watching me, that they knew about the abuse I'd suffered, and that they wanted to help. Enclosed with the letter was a train ticket to Chicago and an address where I could find work and a place to live, surrounded by women who understood exactly what I'd been through. Women who'd survived Charles Beaumont and built new lives from the ashes of the old ones. I sat on the floor of that empty apartment, holding Orion in my lap and reading that letter over and over until the words blurred through my tears. For so long, I'd thought I was alone in the world, that I was the only one foolish enough to be taken in by his lies. But there were others, women who'd not only survived, but found the strength to fight back. That's how I learned that sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or law enforcement. Sometimes it comes from the people who've been hurt finding each other and deciding they won't let the hurting continue. I never did go to Burlington. Instead, I took that train to Chicago, where Ruth Pattison and the others welcomed me like family. We started a small business together, helping other women who'd found themselves in impossible situations. We called it New Beginnings, and over the years we helped hundreds of women escape from men who thought they owned them. Orion grew up surrounded by strong women who taught him that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those who have less power than he does. He became a lawyer, specializing in helping women get free from dangerous marriages. And he always said it was because of the stories he heard growing up about the importance of fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. I'm 82 years old now, and I've learned that the worst things that happen to us don't have to define us. They can transform us instead, if we're brave enough to let them. I married at 16 to a man who tried to destroy me, and my life was never the same, but not in the way anyone expected, including me. If my story has touched you, if you recognize yourself in that frightened young woman I used to be, then share it. Share it because someone else needs to know they're not alone, that there's always a way forward even when you can't see it yet. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these words have traveled. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories about finding strength in the darkest places, then make sure you subscribe to this channel, because every voice matters, and together we can light the way for those still walking in the shadows.